it, like lots of people came, it was fun, and we had a nice time, but really doing it as a public work, I really understood the extent to which like this work was kind of invisible to the general public. To the fact that you do a work like this in central London, and I was going around and saying, you know, what do people think this is flying in the sky, and they just assumed it was another advert or some kind of corporate thing or whatever. It wasn't visible to people in the way that I hoped it would be. And the actual mechanisms that I was trying to trigger and kind of make clear, these questions of surveillance, these questions of data harvesting and processing, like a whole range of complex practices that I was critiquing and trying to share that critique, I realized that these weren't getting through, and worse, they weren't just not getting through, they were actively making the situation worse. And as I said, as part of a cohort of artists and a whole kind of world of digital and media arts, that for a long time now has kind of presented these practices to the public in a very critical way, saying like, these are the ways in which you're being surveilled, these are the ways in which your data is being used. Like, you need to pay attention to the development of AI and training sets and the way all these forms of exploitation and power are occurring. And what it's mostly done is scared people and turned them off, right? And I think this is what most critical practices actually do today, is that by simply illustrating problems that are occurring, however well we explain them, however beautifully we illustrate them, the result is that most people find that realization quite frightening and retreat, and either kind of shut down into kind of apathy in general, or like it actively entrenches that position. It appears to be inevitable. We're kind of actually contributing to a kind of technological determinism that is what we're trying to critique. And that's really the kind of starting point for a re-evaluation of my own practice, but I think for me, a wider idea of what it is we're doing and why. Because I was, as I say, engaged in these kind of practices in various ways for a long time. This is one of many series of works I did, which are called drone shadows, which are these very large-scale illustrations of military technologies. And they were wonderful kind of conversation starters, but they were very much based on this idea that I thought was very important at the time, which was to make the invisible visible, to take these kind of hard to see, hard to understand processes and kind of illustrate them in these powerful and impactful ways. And they certainly succeeded in being kind of illustrative and conversation starters, but like so many of these other practices, been doing them for a decade while the real situation has continued to get worse. I don't think it's like I was ever going to like reverse the tide of military industrial technologies, but to see the way in which discourse around these things has completely failed to shift. And as I say, has in fact got worse over the last multiple decades, is something that I think we have to realistically reckon with and acknowledge. As artists, we tend to also work with these things as materials. So actually my degree 20 years ago was in artificial intelligence, back in the day when it was very boring and everyone thought it was never going to work. The situation has slightly changed then, at least in the discourse and in public things. The technology itself hasn't really changed, it's just got more money behind it. But it's been really interesting working with some material from this time and seeing how years ago, I built my own self-driving car, or at least I trained one. By which I mean I took a vehicle, I attached cameras and sensors to it, and I trained a kind of small neural network on my driving, which is mixed, in order to basically have a better understanding of the system. I felt I needed to work with it very directly. And that produced, as I say, like radically different outcomes to like regarding this stuff from the outside. I mean, I've always worked with code and worked with the materials that I'm interested in critiquing in these ways. But in this case, it produced a very different outcome. I initially went in trying to see how I could treat AI technology systems in general as being collaborators and colleagues and partners in making, rather than as these kind of top-down decision-making systems. And that was moderately successful. The car successfully was trained. It could sort of drive. And I made other things about it. This is an artwork I call the autonomous trap, which is a trap for self-driving cars. So it's a solid circle surrounded by a dash circle, which is the no entry road marking. So if a vehicle that's autonomous drives into this and obeys the rules, which we hope it does, it's unable to leave. Which is fun. But the real thing that came out of that was that I had an understanding of the system as a system that was present in the world in a way that was deeply unexpected to me. That I understood this was a system that was seeing the world and sharing the world and acting in it through a bunch of different sensors and different types of code that gave me an awareness of AI I could never have had from a kind of like from using other people's systems. I had to build the system myself in order to understand of the relations there between regenerative energy, renewable energies, and kind of ecological issues. And as I went walking out into the woods, I kept finding these little markers driven into the ground, these little wooden stakes. And they were kind of every 50 feet or so, kind of going in lines through the woods, and they go this way. And I realized it was this kind of huge survey grid. And I can't stress, like, this is deep in the forest. There was kind of no one else around, just me and the birds, and every now and again these chung wooden stakes through this kind of beautiful untouched forest. If you've never been to Ecology, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. I highly recommend going. It took a bit of research to understand that what I was seeing was a survey grid for oil and gas exploration. That there's an ongoing effort by the Greek government to spur oil and gas exploration in the Ionian Sea and across Ecology and other areas of northern Greece. But what I further discovered was that this work is largely now driven by contemporary computation. That large technology companies, the same ones that I've been critiquing and looking at the big social media and search companies, these big information companies, they were also the same companies that were driving this new wave of oil and gas exploration. And that all these companies, Repsol was the company that was exploring at that time in northern Greece, was partnered up with Google, who have a huge oil and gas algorithm factory for working for these forms of extraction and exploitation. And it was this, again, the realization that the things that I'd worked on for a long time, that while I understood their impacts, felt to be abstract, felt to be kind of cloudy and digital and elsewhere, were like right there on the ground. That these stakes that I was finding in the woods were the kind of tooth marks of artificial intelligence and all those other extractive technologies, actually where it meets the ground, that has this kind of direct effect in place. And so I realized that my critical kind of approaches to technology that saw it as something kind of global and borderless and all these kind of things was really always and totally entangled with the earth and what was happening to it. That what we call AI is kind of it's just one part of a much larger global drive to extract the Earth's resources and do all of the damage that we know is following from that. I wrote a book about monkeys and other things, but I won't tell the story right now. So there's a long history of artist environmental practice, as I'm sure you're all aware. And I was super interested in what forms this took that felt like actual meaningful engagement in the world. And most of the histories that I found felt still like the kind of digital works that I've already critiqued, and I was critiquing my own practice. This kind of pointing at the problem or illustrating to it separately in these ways. A few years ago, I made this, which is a battery. It's a battery made out of 76 lemons, and it was directly inspired by Joseph Beuys's Capri battery. If you've seen this, which there's multiple reproductions of it. I've seen it in a few different museums around the world, and it's literally a lemon with like a lamp socket stuck into it like this. It's called Capri battery, and I think you made it Capri. It's Capri lemon, and it's a very, I love Beuys's work in so many ways, and it's such a direct, brilliant statement about like where power and energy and so on and so forth comes from. But it doesn't work. Right? Like it's a purely illustrative work that you put in a little box and doesn't actually do the thing that it claims to do. And that is something that I found myself kind of increasingly unable to tolerate in my own practice and kind of uninterested in others. That when we make these statements that resonate or illustrate, but don't do the thing, because I think we're past the point where we cannot do the thing. This is a better example. This is Hans Hacker's rainwater purification plant from the 70s, So a couple of years ago I read about this amazing research by some optics scientists where they showed how you could engrave on solar panels. And if you engraved in the right way, you could actually increase the efficiency of the solar panel. Right? And it's basically like tiny grooves that kind of trap more of the photons that would otherwise be reflecting off the glass. And I thought this was incredible because I thought that, like, okay, as an artist, like you could place an image upon something and you would increase the efficiency of its functioning. That's the dream. I subsequently found out that you have to do that. You have to engrave basically a size equivalent to the frequency of light itself, which means it's invisible to the human eye, which is disappointing. But what I did do is instead I developed a technique for engraving on solar panels that doesn't decrease the efficiency. Right? That at least they continue to function as they should, but then they also function as aesthetic objects, and I can kind of smuggle them into museums where they are functioning objects. You plug them into the wall, they generate power, they feed back into that institution, gallery space, exhibition, whatever it is, and they materially change the energy mix. So you are literally taking something away from fossil fuel productions and producing your own power. Production of power is something I'll come back to in a second. So this is like a really simple example of work that works. And it is intended to produce hopefully some kind of change also within the institutions. But of course, half the places these get exhibited, they hang them indoors. I beg them, please put them in the sun. That's kind of the point. And yet quite often this kind of happens. And I think this is worth bringing into the conversation that this is a real structural problem, I think, with the arts today, not just with this idea of like representation of abstraction as the way that operates as pointing to a problem rather than being engaged in it. It's just like structurally it doesn't know how to engage with these things. As a working contemporary art, most kind of gallery situations, this kind of part of the arts, but I think it applies, to lots of other parts of the arts. We operate mostly inside boxes. We operate indoors. We operate in the most hermetically sealed environments we can from the environment that's actually the way that we need to reconnect to. And that's been the trajectory of the arts, it feels like, for quite some time, is to separate itself increasingly from. And you can't make ecological work inside most contemporary institutional art spaces. Plants die inside, right? These are plants that I work with from northern Greece. They're called hyperaccumulators, they're nickel hyperaccumulators. Hyperaccumulators are these amazing plants which, a whole kind of class of plants, all different species. They're capable of growing in quite hostile environments by bringing toxins out of the soil and storing them in their stems and leaves, and therefore remediating the ground for other plants. And this is an experimental plot, again up in Ecology in northern Greece, where researchers from the University of Thessaloniki are using these plants to grow nickel. So these are nickel hyperaccumulators, they're very rich nickel-rich soils, and the plants pull this nickel out of the soil, and then they harvest the plants, leaving the roots of the ground to grow again. They harvest them twice a year, and they can extract nickel from the leaves and stems in this kind of non-extractive process, which is amazing. I've worked with them and written about them, and then I get asked to make exhibitions about this, and you can't make work about this that's not in place, because these plants are incredibly localized. The three species here, one of them grows all around the Mediterranean, one grows in just in Greece and Albania, and one of them, the best one, the one that has the most local knowledge of this place, which is called Bourmola Tenfea, it only grows within this. It only grows within a kind of 50-kilometer radius of this place. So if you want to work with these kind of materials, these organisms, these life forms, these beings, it requires, again, in place. And it really emphasizes the point to which so much of the networks that we operate in are abstract and diffuse and rely on things like residencies and travel and moving things from one place to another, without the structures for being in place for some time, for What I have found that's particularly significant to me in the last few years is that in doing this work, it's transformed my own personal psychology and agency in incredibly meaningful ways that I think are really, really widely important. In my first book, which was largely about a sort of critique of contemporary technology, as I said, there was a chapter in there about the climate and the relationship between technology and the climate. And it's a pretty depressing book in general, and it's a really depressing chapter. Because, as you know, if you spend time with the numbers and the reality, we're in a very, very bad place. And it's looking like it's going to get a lot worse. And if you sit with that for a while, that does stuff to you. It makes you afraid. It's deeply traumatizing. And it traumatized me to spend time with it, but I recognize the interest from readers in that aspect of the chapter, my own interest in what's sat with people. Because also what I saw happening was the same thing that I talked about at the beginning, when we talked about these bad aspects of technology, right? That if you just talk about how terrible things are, people switch off and become acclimatized to it. So they become politically less active and like philosophically less active. They think less about it because it's horrible to think about. And it actually normalizes the situation and makes it even more inevitable. And we can't keep doing that. But one of the effects of it that I think is really significant is that I don't think I'm the only one with climate trauma. I think we've all got it. I think that everyone, pretty much everyone in the world right now, is deeply, deeply afraid of the future, for good reason. And for many, that fear is unconscious, it's sublimated, it's suppressed, but you see it emerging everywhere. Mostly it emerges as fear and as anger, which results in political division and violence, and the tenor of kind of global politics today. There's a deep relationship between that kind of fear that is largely unspoken and everything else. And pointing at the problem, as I say, doesn't change it. It makes it worse. So what I found is that a few years ago I learned to wire up solar panels. It wasn't even for art at first, I just wanted to go camping. And I found that this very simple act of learning, of self-education, of learning from others, towards a very practical goal that was directly engaged with the issues that I was concerned about, made that sense of fear. No, it didn't change the sense of fear, it changed my sense of helplessness, which is really what that fear is based on, right? This fear of complete helplessness in the face of the future. I don't think solar panels are magically going to save us. I don't think any one thing is going to magically save us. But I do fundamentally believe that that the main thing holding us back from making material change at the local scale, community scale, global scale, is this deep feeling of helplessness that many of us have in the face of large complex systems. Large complex systems in all kinds of ways: the financial system, political system, social systems, technological systems, and the climate system. These are all very large complex systems that we live inside all the time and know affect our lives in deep and powerful ways, and yet we have no handholds on them whatsoever. And in this case I found a handhold. we decided, for reasons that you probably understand, given that everything else I've been talking about, we wanted to be in place and do the work that we wanted to do in place, for a place, with that place, rather than having this kind of like abstract, extractive, non-located practice that is the kind of norm for arts practices in so many ways. And one of the things that we insisted on from the beginning was like a pretty DIY ecological basis for what we were doing. So I don't know if anyone recognises this furniture. So all the pieces of furniture in the studio are based on the work of the Italian designer Enzo Mari. Mari's an amazing industrial designer, but also kind of social designer, very politically forthright. And in the 1970s, it all happened in the 1970s. In the 1970s, he produced this guide to producing 24 different pieces of furniture that anyone can build, like the really, really simple structures. And it's a guide to learning to build things. And it has quite a big following and history within design practices as something that has been reproduced many, many times over, and many, many people have made these types of furniture. But also, again, Mari always intended it to be the start of a wider explanation. That you wouldn't just build his furniture, and it's very frustrating now if you go to like a design museum and you see his furniture sitting there as this kind of venerated object, which is not the point. The point was that you learn to build this furniture and then you use it as a basis for designing your own and going on further. But it's, in our studio, the first thing you do if you come and join the studio is you make your chair to sit on, to understand this part of the process and to be part of the practice. And today I mostly work with kind of DIY community practices of this kind. Another huge inspiration for us is the work of Walter Siegel, who was a German-British architect. He came to Britain in the 1940s, and he developed a method of building in timber that gradually became a DIY practice. He was a very modest person and with quite sort of strong, small s socialist kind of ideas. And he believed that like architects should basically make themselves obsolete. I like practices and professions that have this idea that they should become obsolete through sharing their work. And he developed a method of self-building that he could teach to anyone. He believed anyone could build a house. He said if you could cut a piece of wood with a saw and drill a line, drill a hole with a drill, and you can build a house. And there's many, many examples of this. This was there's streets of this housing in South London, and these were buildings that were built with community, in community, by the people who ended up living in them, and many of them still live in them today, brought up their families in them. And what's extraordinary about them is not just that completely ordinary people with no experience build their own homes, and they're lovely homes, and they lived in them, and that the community came out of this collective building. But also, if you read the testimonies of these people, they were utterly transformed by the process in terms of their agency, that they realized that they could do anything after having done this. Any other kind of thing that came along, it was like, well, how hard can this be? We built a house. And so this became a big kind of lodestone for us. So I learned this process and started building at this process. But of course, we're doing it in a very different place. We're not doing it in kind of damp, wet South London, but we're doing it on a Greek island. And so we had to adapt the design in various ways. One of the key ways we did that is on our island and around the Mediterranean and in quite a few other places, we would find inside old buildings, we'd find this stuff stuffed into the walls as insulation. This is seagrass, Posidonia ficea, which, if you know the beaches of the Mediterranean, you know this stuff. It's the stuff that piles up everywhere on the beaches. And historically, it's been used in all kinds of different ways. didn't exist before. It's a hybrid of practices that have been developed elsewhere with new materials, but this is a kind of mix of clay and seagrass. We're in the middle now of a kind of 2-week workshop period. We've got students and others visiting us to come and learn this building technique and work with us to build it, and hopefully then go out and share this knowledge elsewhere. And we've developed the materials and processes, and then we've also tried to share them outwards, because it's not just about some kind of back to the land separation. It's also about sharing this in the artistic ways as much as possible. So this is the installation we made for the Venice Biennale of Architecture last year, in which we were invited to share some of these practices. And so what we learned in our research was that the Murano glass makers in Venice, they used to pack their glass in seagrass for protection, the same material we were using for insulation. So we created these. This is all recycled circular materials. We built the crates, we packed them with seagrass. We made all these various clay vessels from the clay of the island. Egina also has a very long ceramics history, and sent them to Venice alongside the wooden crates, these samples of these architectural materials we produced for the building, which is nice. But it was really interesting seeing it sitting in an exhibition context where it was surrounded with hundreds of other pieces, right? The exhibition made a lot of bold claims about sustainability and its ecological role, and our contribution was part of something called the Materials Lab, right? Where in a huge hall at the Arsenale, alongside several hundred other kind of types of these practices, next to us there was someone who was making fabric out of banana fiber. Then the next one was hempcrete, which is another kind of modern renewable building material, and there was kind of 3D printing in clay. Someone who made arch out of elephant dung. All of these things were amazing, and they were all kind of crammed together into this space with this curatorial approach that was just one of these things will save us, you know, look at all this cool stuff. If you just built with this thing, it would work. And it was such a horrible missed opportunity in this sense of you see the way in which these kind of processes are flattened out when they're all mixed together in this way, that they were just all treated as though they were just the kind of end magical materials that again will kind of save us in this kind of ridiculously linear way. What was interesting about it for us as practitioners and speaking to other people is that they were all the result of people actually working locally, learning in place, and learning from others. I don't overemphasize the insularity of it, but probably also kind of at the margins and at the edges in various ways. But what was interesting was not the material results, was not the final form. It was the process, it was the attitude, it was the idea that as practitioners they could make meaningful, practical stuff in creative ways that actually contributed. And so to doing this work, I'm nearly done, I promise. In making this work, we found ourselves through the seagrass connected with these practices in so many ways. We're making, this is part of a current research project where we're mapping the seagrass meadows around the island. Seagrass is incredibly important for ecosystems, and of course it's under threat. And there's big research efforts to map it and sustain it, but who better to do that work than people who actually are with it? So we're mapping our local seagrasses, but also working with scientific organisations that do this at a much larger scale, to, as I say, do our own creative practices, but also to feed into, in meaningful, useful ways, into larger scientific efforts. So we do the kind of ground truthing of their abstracted research because we're in place. And again, we communicate that back out. This summer we're going to cover the tavernas of the island with tablecloths in the sort of traditional taverna style, but show both the meadows that give people information on safe anchoring and fishing and so on and so forth, in order to try and bring a little bit of what we've learned, mostly to visitors. Obviously most locals know a lot of this stuff already, but making it public and sharing it matters. But the most important thing, I'm going to finish now, the most important thing about this kind of practice is I've got to know, in this case, seagrass as an organism through this work. something that most people are scared of when they go swimming. I've got to know this organism as I've got to know so many others through this work. And I've been profoundly changed by this encounter. And this, for me, is the most important part of doing ecological work in any way, is that it should be profoundly changing. That it's an intimate meeting with partners and other organisms and other beings who are part of the work that we need to do. And and when that meeting truly happens, that's when real meaningful change occurs, and that we can't change any of the things that we're concerned about, if you're concerned about them, without fundamentally changing ourselves and the system of relationships that we're enmeshed in. And you can do that very critically wherever you are, in whatever form you're practicing, because the world is outside these walls all around and really desperate to work with you on it. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Yeah, happy to do questions. If that was interesting or resonant with you, I'd love to hear about other people's practices, how they engage with these questions as well.
Yes, so we may have a microphone available, but if not, people can shout out, and the design of the space should help to support that. But do we have one? No, we're confirming. Maybe not. But just to start it off, while you're thinking of your questions, James, there was so much in that talk. Thank you for sharing your trajectory. I think, even if people are not engaged in ecological art, I think that there's a way that probably many people in this room can relate to the process of kind of grappling with your own context and the institutions that shape your work and the systems that shape your work, and trying to rethink that trajectory and find ways to learn in community with other people, and just to rethink one's practice and positionality. So just appreciate you sharing and reflecting. One question on that note to kind of help us start is that you talked in various ways about some of the limitations of how your past projects have been presented, and as well as other kind of histories of technology and ecology-oriented art practice. And I guess I was just wondering if you could, share some additional thoughts. You kind of hinted at some of these about ways that organizations that are presenting in various ways the kind of critical interventions like those that you're engaged with, ways that they could sort of do their work better. Again, because people here have a lot of different backgrounds, and not everyone runs contemporary art museums that share ecological art, but they do teach, and they present in various ways. And so just wondering if you could talk a little bit about those kind of, maybe for lack of a better word, sort of institutional best practices for sharing, disseminating, presenting critical kind of place-based work of this kind.
Thanks. I'd say what's been really transformative for our practice is just, on the one hand, very much letting go of any idea of trying to be perfect. Because I think that's something that hobbles a lot of attempts to do good ecological work. It feels a bit overwhelming, and if you can't do it, perfectly, and you're aware of all the complex difficulties of it, it often becomes something that just sort of really doesn't get done at all. But at the same time, it's about making a really, really quite meaningful commitment to actually enacting everything that it's possible to do. To be very clear that any practice, whatever it is, starts from this position of putting the and that is the basis on which all decisions are made. And if that comes in at the beginning, it starts off feeling like a chore. It starts feeling like it's too hard to think through all these aspects, or to in the simplest possible terms, do the right thing at all times. And that often feels, let's say, overwhelming, and it falls victim to this thing of the perfect being the enemy of the good. But very quickly, in our experience, it also becomes transformative, because it really redirects any aspect of this work towards a far more conscious and related practice that makes it more rewarding and interesting. And you have to give up a bunch of ideas about what it is that you maybe thought you were trying to do, because you put a bunch of like serious constraints on the work. And constraints in this case are often very, very rewarding. And so they have very hard conversations with institutions or the process about conditions of work, including political conditions. That's the thing that's shaped my practice a lot in recent years, is being involved in various campaigns, boycotts, and so on and so forth. That's had real material consequences for the work, and for my work and my life and my income and these kind of things. But that's just part of the practice and shapes it in what I've found to be this incredibly rewarding way. So yeah, I think it's just that. It's regarding these, some of these commitments to ecological ways of working, in whatever form that takes in one's practice, as being these productive constraints, and kind of generators of new ways of doing things, rather than being kind of barriers to achieving what you thought you were trying to do.
Okay, so Phil has a mic. If anyone in the audience has questions, someone right here, the first hand, and then a second one back there. We'll start there.
Hello, thanks for the great talk. It's a question about you as an artist working in the ecosystem of the arts as well. So me and my partner work a lot with AI, robotics, and ecological systems. And museums, institutions, and other parts of the art world are extremely ill-suited to contain these, as you were sort of mentioning. How's your view on how curators, institutions, collectors, and other parts of the art world are also sort of joining this ecological shift and working towards, maybe working outside of the museums, working traditional ways of exhibiting these dead objects and closed systems?
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost entirely focused on finding ways to work outside those institutions, because for me, the kind of institution I think you're referring to, the ones I've worked with in time, they're so caught up in systems that are not just sclerotic and very difficult to change, but are actively working in opposite directions to what we're trying to achieve. The kind of neoliberalization and financialization of institutions and collectors networks and all this kind of stuff, it is quite simply antithetical to what we're trying to do.
problem that is in society, and you look at it, and I'm finding that you're looking at local ways, local ingredients, local systems that can help, and then you're working together with people. So you're not taking the path that is typical, but you're trying many different ways with groups of people to locally solve the issues that concern you and your team. Am I close?
Yes.
And how is that, how can you give that to the youth? Or how are we communicating, or what would you suggest? that we
Yeah.
do with the youth?
So yeah, I mean, we mostly, throughout my work, I've always just like looked at the things in front of me that I find to be interesting. Not necessarily as problems to be solved, but simply these are things that seem to reward thinking about in various ways. And then tried to work with them. And that's become more and more practical over time, and more focused on like actual needs rather than just whatever I find interesting. But I genuinely find these things interesting, so I'm lucky enough to keep working on things that are interesting. I think I'm right. It's like the question is about like how this gets disseminated or shared or becomes something slightly more than that. My feeling is that these all of these things are things that start locally but get shared, not scaled up, but kind of scaled out as an attitude of mind, that people realize that they can actually get involved in this thing. As I say, the most fundamental transformative experience for me and I've seen happen in others, is the kind of lifting of this feeling of helplessness. And that we have a society, and indeed as a result, forms of governance and educational systems that are essentially designed to reinforce our sense of helplessness in every possible way. And technological systems are currently doing this as well. And we're confronted constantly with images of a world that is completely out of our control, and mostly because it's just somewhere else, right? And yet we can't do anything about it. But the feeling that one gets when one engages, it doesn't have to be specifically locally, but engages with something that is at a scale at which one can change things. I was in Brussels recently, and there was I was talking to someone who does like amazing policy work at the kind of European Council level, and they're proposing all this amazing stuff, and they fund a bunch of stuff and whatever. But she said to me that she reads and writes all these papers about biodiversity and invasive species and climate change and so on and so forth, that don't mention the name of a single bird or mountain or forest. That the whole thing has become so completely abstract that there's like no meaningful engagement, and like nothing comes of that ultimately. There's no relationship that's possible to have without that specific relationship. And so yeah, when I work with students and when I was visiting or whatever, like it's always about like trying to find like a deeply practical connection between the things that are being discussed and where you can actually see something happening as a result of what you do. And that can be so minor and so small, but it builds a muscle. I always go back to James C. Scott's essay on anarchist calisthenics, if anyone's familiar with this. So James C. Scott of Seeing Like a Stage and Against the Grain fame, but he wrote this essay called Anarchist Calisthenics, which is about his time in East Germany, just as East Germany ceased to be East Germany, working on a collective farm and seeing how kind of broken people were by years of totalitarianism, and how they kind of couldn't act in any meaningful way. This came up to him when he kept trying to cross the road, and there was a red light, and there was no traffic, and no one would cross the road because they were very German about it. And so he would occasionally break the rules and get like yelled at. But he said like you have to break the small rules on the regular so that you're ready to break the big rules when it matters. That's anarchist calisthenics. It's kind of building this muscle of practice. And I think it's the same for this kind of stuff. It's learning small things as much as possible in whatever way, because we don't know what's going to be useful. We don't know what we're going to need. No one knows right now, but we're going to need a lot. And we need to be ready to learn that when it becomes kind of
So my comment is about the seagrass that you're using for infill. And in Louisiana, we use a similar type of infill. It's called buciage. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it is actually a mixture of Spanish moss, clay, and natural fibrous materials. And it was actually one of the first coerced collaborations between Native Americans and enslaved Africans. And I always find it fascinating because right now at our museum we are attempting to actually remove the gypsum that's over it, so it's the humidity has become trapped inside of it, and so you can see the crumbling on the walls. Right? And so I just think there's a brilliance to that technique, and there's something to be said about that type of work that has withstood hundreds of years when everything else has fallen apart, and through hurricanes as well. So it was really interesting hearing you speak about that. My question though has to do with the energy centers you mentioned. So I find that quite fascinating and hopeful also. And I don't know how far along you are in your process with that, so I'd like to hear about that perhaps. And I think it's just something that would work really well also on our site. We are on a plantation, and the idea is being able to return without replicating extraction. And we work with descendant populations in the community a lot. We're just really trying to find processes and techniques to engage everyone and to be ecologically friendly as we return to that site. So I'm just curious to hear about what you have to say about that.
Thanks so much, Shag. I'd love to know more about the technique you're describing, because we're making stuff up as we go along. There's lots of amazing examples to be adapted. With regard to the energy communities, so energy communities are a thing. They're a legal form in Europe. They're very slightly country by country, but there's loads of them in Greece and elsewhere. And it's basically you have to get a certain number of people together, and then you can start like this legal entity, which essentially is a small energy company. But it's specifically focused around non-profit work. It's designed to be very separate from having a profit-making corporation for generating energy. It's designed to generate energy just for its members, and that can be in various forms, whatever suitable. People do hydro, wind, solar power, and stuff. We're probably going to do a lot of battery as well, so you get into storage, which is super fascinating. But you can then also, this might be a bit interesting, you can then combine that. So when I talked about this garden we're planting, the technical term is agrivoltaics, which is basically where you combine forms of agriculture with forms of power generation. So here, where we have a very dry and warming climate, like growing seasons are shifting massively, but you can increase your yields by growing in the shade of solar panels. So you can grow vegetables and stuff under the solar panels, or you can graze animals and all this kind of thing. So you can really combine these different things in really powerful ways. And for me, it's a real example of the way in which these regenerative practices can actually be kind of multiplicative. You actually get a whole bunch of other unexpected benefits out of doing them. But like for me, the symbolic power of it is also so key, that you are generating power, but you are redistributing power, like literally, in the form of electrons, but in terms of agency as well. And it's it's one of those big things that we kind of have got used to getting from elsewhere, from not thinking about, from being largely hidden for us, from being a kind of provision of the state or large corporations has total control over. And the power of taking that back, again, it's very literal form of re-empowerment is just incredibly stimulating.
There's one more, we have time for one more, and then Philip will wrap us up and tell us where we're going.
Very good, this will be short. James, thank you so much. Your flamingo picture will stay with me for many moons to come. So picture this, a very sincere 10-year-old approaches you and asks you, what's the meaning of life? What do you tell her?
That's a question. I have a 6-year-old, so someone asks me that on a daily basis. I would say I would say that I could answer in very, very long form, but I will say that a lot of what I'm doing is not an attempt to answer that question, but an attempt to be the path for answering that question. One of the reasons I decided
Thank you so much.